minute. So my name is Michael Barton. I'll be your host today. Adil, I think, will be joining in just a few minutes. But in the meantime, I'll be your host today. I'm coming to you from Kipuktuk in the land of Mi'kmaq, traditional unceded lands of the Mi'kmaq Nations. Very happy to have you with us right across the country today. And any of you who were able to attend Jessica's very impactful year will, of course, remember. I mean, so she's actually going to help us with the next step today, which actually I won't give away the bio, but really excited to have Jessica with us again today. And I won't steal Marie-Ange's thunder because she's going to do the little intro and bio. Very happy to have folks with us today. A little bit of housekeeping, of course. Really happy to, once again, second year in a row, to have like the entire month of March to celebrate women in engineering right across Canada. So we have some fantastic content with that. Little plug, if you haven't already, actually I haven't, I really need to book my hotel. If you plan, and really encourage you to attend the national conference in Toronto, make your register for the conference, get your hotel, it's all that good stuff. And as always, I'll look at the questions. I'll watch them as we go along through the session. Please use the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A little box. I'll monitor that. And if I can type a quick little response during the session, fine, I'll do that. I suspect most questions will wait till the end to have a fully thought out and appropriate response at the very end. Jess is going to speak for about 45-ish minutes, and whatever number of minutes, if I stop blabbing, that are left at the end, we'll have for Q&A as normal. Also as normal, the session will be recorded on our YouTube channel after content from before, so maybe check out her session from last year or other sessions. And then also, if you couldn't stay for this whole session or whatever, because lunchtimes we get interrupted all the time. And if we don't have a chance to answer all questions during the Q&A, we'll take all of those, send them to Jessica, she'll answer them, and then we'll do a blast out with the responses. So lots of talking there. Marie-Ange, I cede the floor to you, and please introduce our esteemed guest today.
Thank you so much, Michael. Jessica Vandenberghe is a professional engineer, and she's a member of the Dene Ta First Nation. She's a 60s coup survivor and raised in an inclusive German farming family in northern Alberta. Her exceptional career is based on 2 engineering degrees from the University of Alberta. She has worked in the oil sands, mining, regulatory, infrastructure, consulting industries, and academia. She is the Assistant Dean, Community and Culture with the Faculty of Engineering and Computer Science at the University of Victoria, and the owner of Guiding Star Consulting. She's a mother of 2, and at the intersection of 2 equity-deserving groups in the engineering profession, which drives her passion for equity, diversity, and inclusion, along with truth and reconciliation. She believes that we can walk together to heal, build strong relationships, teach ethical and respectful behavior, and be change makers to create progressive and inclusive legislation, communities, and organizations. I welcome Jessica to the floor.
Thank you so much for the invitation and kind introduction. I am just going to share my slide deck here. Here we go. And thanks to everyone for joining in today. We're going to chat about land acknowledgements, territorial acknowledgements, and go through a number of examples as well. But I'll open with my own land acknowledgements. So it's always an honor to be able to ask to be acknowledged, to acknowledge the land. Today finds me on the traditional territories of Treaty 6 in the North Saskatchewan River Métis Territory in what's known as the Miskatchewan or Edmonton, Alberta. And I just want to take a moment to really recognize that Land Spirit does so much for us. She nourishes us and protects us and looks after us. And Indigenous people have been here since time immemorial as stewards of the land. And it really saddens me and angers me to know the oppression that our First Nations, Métis, Inuit brothers and sisters and cousins have undergone, and that we really do need that commitment to truth and reconciliation. So I'm just so glad that your organization is bringing in talks like this so that we can continue the discussion and our work on truth and reconciliation. All right, so I always like to start with this slide because, again, in this type of venue, it's a little bit hard to know where folks are starting at with truth reconciliation. Not everybody is always ready for these conversations, and everybody starts at a bit of a different area of knowledge. And so there are folks that hang out in that fear zone. They're a little bit worried about these discussions. Sometimes in the fear zone, folks take it to the extreme of denying residential school attendance and the impacts of it. And deny that racism exists within Canada. We tend to work more with folks that are in those learning and growth zones. So the learning zone is where folks are a little bit hesitant, a little bit worried about offending, not quite sure where to start their journey. Maybe they want to write a land acknowledgement and just need the encouragement of a workshop or a discussion like this in order to move into that growth zone. And that growth zone is where we are actively working on reconciliations. We are quite knowledgeable in the truth. And we move between all of these zones depending what you're engaging in. So for example, if you get to the point where you're comfortable with land acknowledgements, it might be intimidating and it might put you back in the fear zone for your first time going to a ceremony or going into community. Or if your first time talking to your elected officials about change that needs to be made, or being part of advocate efforts or different things that you take up in terms of reconciliations, might put you back in that fear zone. And then it's building up the courage and the humility again to move into those learning and growth zones. So usually when I do a workshop like this, the first question people ask is when and where to use land acknowledgements. So I just want to address this one right up front. It's always appropriate to use land acknowledgements. You can use them on your own. You can use them within large organizations, within meetings, within conferences, within small gatherings. It's really a mindfulness gesture in order to bring truth and reconciliation to the mind. And sometimes it's also used just as a grounding in order to set the tone of the 7 sacred teachings of respect and courage and humility, truth, honesty, and from that side of things as well for the conversation. So you are free to use land acknowledgements whenever you want, even to yourself in the morning, just being grateful for the lands that we wake up on and what land does for us, and thinking about what needs to be done in order to restore the relationship with land and who has looked after it and stewarded those relationships since time immemorial. So today we're going to go through a number of different topics relative to land acknowledgements. So we're going to acknowledge the oppression and colonization, a little bit, touch on the truth. We're going to talk about stolen lands and treaty and what is treaty. We're going to talk about different worldviews towards land spirit. And then we're going to explore a little bit our relationships with land spirit. And then I'm going to give you a couple examples of land acknowledgements in different mediums, as well as share my own land acknowledgement and break it down for you. As an engineer, we like to break things down. So I'll break it down into the components of my own. So we always need to start though with truth. So truth and reconciliation need to go together, and truth always needs to come first. We need to recognize the oppression and the effects of colonization of Turtle Island on First Nations, Métis, Inuit people, and really come face to face with that. So here in Canada, the upper half of Turtle Island, we have 3 very distinct demographics. We have First Nations, who have been here since time immemorial, so over 20,000 years here on these lands. First Nations, as categorized by the government, we have over 600 First Nations recognized. We know those categories aren't entirely accurate. We know that there are some listed as extinct when there are descendants still living here. We know we have First Nations people in the States who can't find their way back across the border because their nations are listed as extinct. We know there are nations grouped together, categorized as a singular nation when they're 3 very distinct nations, sometimes very geographically far from each other as well. And we know that not every hereditary nation is recognized by the government either. So it's a bit complicated knowing the number of nations, which is why when we do our land acknowledgements, we really got to do our homework and understand who has set footsteps and left their hearts on the lands that we walk on. The Métis, of course, another distinct demographic in terms under that umbrella term of Indigenous. Métis people, one common misconception is that Métis is any First Nations European blood mixed together, but that's not true. Métis trace their ancestries back to their ancestors that lived around the Hudson's Bay, typically in the Red River area, the early unions between early fur traders and First Nations people. Their culture is very distinct from First Nation, even though there are tenets that seem familiar amongst the both. But their culture is distinct, and they're recognized as an independent, very different demographic within Canada here. And then we have our Inuit cousins to the north, who have also been here since time immemorial, over 20,000 years, living in harmony with land spirits in the north. And their pathways, their ancestry, their ways that they have been exposed to oppression and colonization have been different than First Nations, and again, different than the Metis. And so it's important to know these distinct, very distinct demographic groups, because when we do land acknowledgements, we need to really recognize all three of those, because trade and travel and exchange of knowledge, exchange of goods across Turtle Island contributed to the stewardship of the lands that we stand on and the teachings of the land that we have here. So as we talk about the effects of colonization, we really need to recognize what happened to First Nations, Métis, Inuit people and the active oppression. This is a quote from Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald from 1883. It says, "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. And though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training mode of thought are Indian, and he is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly impressed upon myself as head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence. And the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes and thought of white men." So we know that the intent of the Indian Act is oppression. It's one of the most oppressive pieces of legislation in the world. It's one that still exists today. For the Métis, the oppression acts towards them wasn't cemented in legislation. Instead, it was in the taking of their land, and resulting in script which was never seen through by the government. And the Inuit, again, didn't fall under an oppressive piece of legislation, but instead the tactic taken for the Inuit was the slaughter of their sled dogs to the point of extinction. And all of these were taken with the intent of assimilation, of removing the Indian problem, killing the Indian in the child, another quote from Sir John A. Macdonald. And really, oppression came about within Canada and still exists today in systemic racism. When we think about what this resulted in, it resulted in many, many different things that took our population from 100%, of which we were in the millions. There are no clear studies that say how many millions existed in Turtle Island, because of course, prior to colonization, censuses weren't really done. But we were 100% of the population. With the oncoming of settlers and folks coming to Turtle Island, we saw things come like slavery. Brown University lists between 1.5 and 5 million Indigenous people enslaved. We know the effect of disease wiped out a large portion of the populations, new diseases being introduced. We know with the Indian Act came residential schools, so 139 residential schools that operated in this country. I know the first is quoted as having started to be operated in the late 1800s. There's other data that suggests that the first residential school came about in the 1600s. So centuries and centuries of these schools and our people being put into the school. So multiple generations in which the point of the school was not education, it was assimilation through abuse and different tactics that were caused a lot of intergenerational harm. One thing a lot of people don't talk about is the day schools. So there were 700 day schools in operations using the same tactics that residential schools did. The difference between residential schools and day schools is that for residential schools, the Indian agents would go and actively take the children from community and take them far from their community and put them in the school, and they were boarded at the school. Day schools operated on the reserves and the children went home afterwards, but the tactics were still the same. The intent was not education, it was assimilation. There was segregation in terms of the medical system. 29 Indian hospitals operated within Canada. and operated up until the late 1900s, prior to the year 2000, of course, but we know residential schools operated up to 1997. So centuries and centuries of segregation, of active work for oppression and assimilation. I'm born to two residential school survivor parents. They both went to the schools for over 10 years, and it took its toll on them, and intergenerational trauma. I have numerous family members who went to day schools and residential schools. I was born in an Indian hospital, and that hospital still stands today in Edmonton, just north of the river. And we know that a lot of our people were also subjects to things like medical testing, especially during the World Wars. We know the Canada Food Guide was developed based on malnutrition tests on residential school kids. From the Metis side of things, road allowance communities popped up. So again, the Metis descendants of early fur traders and First Nations people, they settled mainly a lot around the Hudson's Bay, throughout Quebec and Northern Ontario into Manitoba, a lot in Manitoba. Land was taken from them without consultation, sold underneath them to the fur trade companies, to Lord Selkirk, and they were promised land in return or monetary value in return. There's something called script, so they were given a promissory note. That system was never fully set up, but while waiting for land so they can make their communities, they would make their homes in the road allowance that runs beside highways. So where the ditches run and where the infrastructure, power lines, utilities run, in the road allowance, they would make their communities. And those communities were still in existence up until the early 2000s, I think 2004, 2005, in that kind of range. And then, of course, there was the 60 scoop. And so the 60 scoop was putting children not just in residential schools and boarding schools, but also placed into European, typically Christian families to be raised away from their communities again. And I am a survivor of the 60s scoop. So all of this, a lot of tactics taken with the intent of oppression. It wasn't the intent of education. It wasn't with the intent of helping or building strong communities or finding a reciprocal way to work together. It wasn't that. It was oppression. I'm going to play this video for you. And just in the chat, if someone can just let me know that the sound is working.
I was 6 years old when they took me to a residential school. I remember the day walking toward that school with my mother, and it was a silent walk, and I was so afraid. 20 or 30 little kids herded into the showers, and then your body being painted in white liquid of some kind, your hair cropped and then doused in kerosene. And that was pretty traumatizing. The school held roughly 220 people, half boys, half girls, and we were segregated. If I was caught waving at my sister, there'd be a punishment for it. And so as a result of that segregation, I never really learned any social skills that young people should be learning as they grow up. From a religious and spiritual perspective, of course, the churches lobbied hard to convert Indigenous people, Aboriginal people. They said that we were heathen and pagan. They targeted language in those things we had learned through all of millennia to know where we came from, to know who we were, as something that had to be eliminated. Before that time, I lived in a place called Playastums. They call it Guilford Island now. We harvested from the forest all of the animals that we needed to provide us sustenance, and from the ocean in front of us as well, all of the species of whales and mink and fish. And I had a connection to the environment around us. And so after having spent years in those schools, by the time we were ready to leave, most of us were pretty broken. Many of us, including myself, descended into addictions, alcoholism, and violence, and it was pretty difficult. Those schools lasted for over 100 years. There were over 150,000 little children. And the last school that closed in Canada was in 1996 in Saskatchewan. There was a history on this land that had been absolutely ignored. Nobody knew about the residential school legacy. Nobody knew about the intent of the Indian Act, the chronic challenges now facing Aboriginals. And we're starting to accept the idea that we have the shared history for which we all are responsible for. When the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report was submitted, I was in the room when Justice Murray Sinclair, the chair of the commission, denounced Canada. He had just recited a litany of intensive harms against Aboriginal people. And when he said, Canada, you have committed cultural genocide, there was just a silence in that room, and then all of a sudden it erupted in euphoria. We said survivors want an apology from the Prime Minister in the House of Commons. And I was there and I heard the words, I'm sorry. And then I couldn't see because my eyes were just flowing with tears. I was so happy that somebody had said, I'm sorry. Canada, by the way, is the only Western country that has had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we're trying to look through a new lens. We and Canadians, we as an Aboriginal, we celebrate each other, everybody cheering each other up as we move toward a more equal, prosperous future for all of us. My name is Chief Robert Joseph, and I believe that Truth and Reconciliation is Canada.
So I wanted to share that so that we really take in and appreciate what Truth and Reconciliation is about and what it means to Indigenous people. We heard Chief Robert Joseph talk about what it meant to hear an apology, to be heard, to be recognized. And that's really what we need to take away. So again, as we talk about things like land acknowledgement, we need to appreciate the truth side of things. We need to appreciate the acts of oppression, the impact of colonization in the things that we do. And we got to recognize too, as we talk about land acknowledgements, when we talk about land, that a lot of the land has been stolen. And we need to recognize what treaty means as well, and how that all worked at that time of Canada becoming a country. So land acknowledgements are a stepping stone as well to honoring those broken treaty relationships. So we really need to do a little bit of exploration into what is treaty. And so, again, just taking us back prior to colonization, so prior to the 1400s, prior to the doctrine of discovery coming out and asking early explorers to convert anybody that they come to Christian, and that anything they come across is theirs, that they can take possession of. Prior to that whole tenet of less than human that goes throughout the oppressive actions that happen to Indigenous people, we had First Nations, we had Inuit, and they've been here again since time immemorial. So since they've been here since time immemorial, they know the land really well. We had ways of governance, we had ways of resolving, we had ways of trade, we had ways of commerce, we had ways of engineering and technology. We had mineral working, we had cities, we had thriving populations, safe and healthy communities, medical, our own ways of medical systems, working with the plants through observation of the natural world, and just a way of being that worked for Indigenous people. And so we're going to talk a little bit about worldview in a second, but you got to remember that prior to colonization, the way of being was there was no land ownership. Land was treated as a spirit. Nations could move freely around the land, and it worked in a way that's very different than the way that we see today, where we have borders on a map. And so when we talk about broken treaties, the freedom of Indigenous people just to move around the land. And what happened with all of that, we need to really recognize that we went from being able to move freely around North America, so in between those borders between what is now known as Canada and the US, as well as between anywhere in Canada across provincial and Northwest Territory borders, to being confined to small parcels of land called reserves. And so the land here, the red dots on the screen, are where the reserves are within Canada. So really moving from, freedom to go everywhere to a freedom of being confined to reserve land that wasn't necessarily where traditional hunting or trapping was done, nor necessarily where ceremony was done. So the control of the government with regards to reserves still exists today. They can move the reserves at their will. And a good example is that Cowessess First Nation, which is now located in Saskatchewan, used to be in Alberta. And the government moved it when the oil and gas boom in Alberta happened, and there was a lot of really wealthy oil and gas deposits found within Alberta. That reserve was moved. We see that same kind of movement happening with the Metis settlements. There's 8 parcels of land in Alberta, the only ones in Canada, the only land that Metis have. The rest was taken through script. Again, it started with 12 parcels of land, and the government again took back 4 of those once oil and gas resources were found underneath those parcels of land. And so this relationship with land goes from this freedom of moving around and being able to be stewards of all the land to being confined to reserves, being oppressed through schools and abuse through the schools, resulting in socioeconomic downturn, a different funding model, different land ownership model, all of that leading to the state where we are today, where we do have some reserves in very poor state with boil water advisories. We have some that are in healthier state where the water flows clean, but still quite a variety across the land. But what we really need to back up to as well is treaty. And so again, Canada was recognized as a colony of Britain in 1867. And not all the provinces were made at that time. We know up until the early 1900s, provinces were being made to what we know today. The last territory was created in 1999 with Nunavut. But prior to 1867, agreements were made with Indigenous people, and those were called treaty. So this reads from Anishinaabe Elder Harry Bone, and he says, a long time ago when the treaties were made, one of the chiefs got up and pointed towards the heavens, and he said, the sun is my father and the land is my mother. They teach us we have a responsibility in our generation, in our lifetime. Up to the horizons, beyond that is seen, is the 7 generations as far as you can see. That's our responsibility, to teach those generations about our wisdom and our knowledge about our people. We have a responsibility to keep the treaty alive in our lifetime for future generations. And so treaties really are different than what a lot of people think about them as. A lot of folks think about them in the European context of being a contract. Contracts are tended to be written, excuse me, in a way that anticipates failure of relationship or termination. A lot of the tenets of a contract are about what happens if we need to end this relationship. Treaty is very different than that. Treaty upholds the principles of reciprocity, of respect and renewal. It's rooted in thousands of years of experience and presence on the land. So treaty is something that you enter into that has a spiritual meaning, it has a relational connection, and it has a continual dynamic element to it. Excuse me. They are living agreements that evolve over time. They're centered on the principles about land and nationhood that are embedded in ceremonies, protocols, and discussions of treaties. So the creation of a treaty is done on the land, with the land, between different relations, between different parties, with a lot of ceremony. It's rooted in the land because the land remembers our promises to each other beyond our lifetime. And so again, a treaty is treated as something that is there forever. So if you, for example, are creating a relationship with an elder or a knowledge keeper, you're entering into a treaty with them. You're entering into a relationship that's ongoing for the rest of your lives. And it's not always viewed that way in our modern business world. But this is what the intent of treaties were. So it's a relationship between the people and the land, which means they're inseparable, and that the land is a living entity and that requires care for which the people are responsible. So as Indigenous people, we have treaty with the land too. So a responsibility to look after our relation, treating the land as a relation, as a revered grandmother, not taking more than we ask for, treating her with gratitude and with respect and ceremony. So woven into the treaties is familiar love, and it allows for disagreement without disrespect. So prior to colonization, there were a number of treaties signed, and there's still treaties being signed today. But the intent of these treaties was that we could share the land. How do we work with settlers? How do we work with Indigenous people to care for the land and live on the land and move freely about the land? And who is stewarding to the land? And so these treaties were entered into with this intent of reciprocity and respect. And then it comes this work being done by Britain when they wanted to take Canada as a colony to itself in 1867 when we became a country. And then immediately after the country was made, the Indian Act was put into effect. So even though the treaties were signed with the Crown prior to Canada becoming a country, there was an intent of eventually leading that to oppression of Indigenous people so the resources could be taken. So why is treaty important though? It gives us an ability for land title in the modern day system that works today for land ownership. It captures land rights, hereditary lands as well. So again, with the onset of the Indian Act, the creation of reserves, placing people onto those reserves, again, those reserves not being selected by the people, but being selected by the government. So often they weren't where the hereditary lands were. So you can imagine what that must have felt like. Your family living in a place for 20,000 years, and then all of a sudden Indian agents coming and herding you off to a parcel of land that's unfamiliar, and placing you within this parcel of land. You can't leave without you getting your passport signed by the Indian agent. Your family might be placed at different reserves. You might not be together, but you might be away from the place of ceremonies, the place of hunting and fishing that you know, the plants and animals that you know, and your relation. So treaty is important because it gives access to those hereditary lands for those traditional land uses. We know, again, that there is lots of land claims in the court system right now because there were treaties signed. There were treaties signed with the Crown prior to Canada becoming a country. We know this all ties into human rights as well. So again, the tenets of the doctrine of discovery allowed for the taking of land, the placement of people being stripped of their rights, oppressive actions in order to try to erase the whole identity of Indigenous people by placing them in schools and punishing them to the point of trying to reprogram Indigenous people, and then putting in a whole bunch of different systems like member systems and denying rights to legal access and segregation in the medical system and all these things. Treaty is important that we remember as well, because we do need to restore cultural Indigenous ways that were stripped of us. So just a quick look again at treaty is that treaties have been signed for a long time. So since the 1850s, some of the first treaties were the Douglas treaties. We know from the wampum belt stories from the East when early settlers came that there were treaties prior to that as well. The number of treaties came about and still there. So I'm sitting in the traditional territory Treaty 6 right now. So we know we have all these number of treaties throughout the central Canada. We have things like the Robinson treaties, Williams treaties, a number of treaties that date back to the beginning and onset of explorers. So all of these were signed with the intent of reciprocity and respect, as well as freedom to move around the land in order to use it for traditional use, but also in responsibility of environmental stewardship, sustainability, or what we know as caring for your relations, land spirit herself. So there are still, as I mentioned, treaties being signed today. Land is always something that's being talked about because, again, being confined to reserves isn't sustainable or healthy. It doesn't allow us to create safe, healthy communities in traditional areas and restore cultural ways. There's all sorts of land settlement claims happening in the courts all the time. One of the biggest being Nunavut. So Nunavut came about because of a land settlement, and this was done in 1999. All right, so that's a little bit about treaty, and that needs to be appreciated when we do our land acknowledgements. We need to recognize the traditional hereditary lands on which we move and work and play, and know that treaty is a complicated thing, and that land and who resides on the land is complicated as well. And also to remember that reserves aren't necessarily on hereditary lands. The other aspect that we need to talk about relative to land acknowledgements is the different worldviews towards land spirit. And so this graphic comes from Tribal Trade, and shows, to me, it resonates quite well around the differences in the worldviews towards land. So in the Western worldview, there's a hierarchy. Even in the category of man, there's a hierarchy with respect to gender expression, sexual orientation, respect to race, all different hierarchies just in this alone, above which you have man having oversight of animals, and then plants being lesser than that, and land being at the bottom here. Land is treated in this worldview as a commodity. It's treated as something that you can buy and sell. You can draw a dotted line around on a map and somebody can own. It's treated as something you can extract all the minerals from, the water from, the energy from, and just leave. You can bury your waste in the land and leave it to rot. You can introduce different plants and animals and foreign materials into the land, and that's okay. So in this worldview, in the one that we live in right now, that's how land is looked at and treated. If we looked at the Indigenous worldview towards land, land is treated as a spirit. So you treat land as a respected grandmother. You treat her with gratitude, respect, with ceremony. You don't take more than you need, and you care for her like you would care for a respected grandmother. When we're taught the 7 sacred teachings, the first teaching is humility, and we're taught that our spirit is no bigger than anybody else's spirit. So it's no bigger than the spirit of an ant. It's no bigger than a spirit of a planet. It's no bigger than the spirit of the water. It's no bigger than the spirit of the land. And so we are all equal spirits, and we need to look after each other in the ecosystems and the collective interactions that happen between all of us. And so we all sit in reciprocity, and we all sit with equal sized spirits. And so in that worldview, the treatment of land is an equal partner at the table, and one that you respect and revere and treat with gratitude. So very different worldviews. Just looking at the time, I think I'm going to skip this video, but I will pop this link into the chat at the end. Sorry, I didn't mean to stop the share. Just let me jump back here. Let me find my button. There we go. All right, but I'll share that video into the chat once we're done here. And it just talks about the relationship with Mother Nature, that we as Indigenous people follow natural law. The teachings from Elder Dave Korshan, and Elder Dave Korshan has gone to the spirit world as of a couple of years ago, and we honor his teachings that he gave us as well. The other worldview, there's a lot of teachings that go into explaining Indigenous worldview. And again, how you teach these value systems, how you teach these ways of being vary between the nations, and between Metis and Inuit as well. But this one I wanted to chat about as well. So all my relations ties into these different worldviews. So again, treating land spirit as a relation. The other teaching I want to share is one, it's called Wakotoin in Plains Cree. So this comes from This word comes from the Plains Cree, but talks about the interactions between all of us, that we're all part of systems that are bigger than us, and we need to remember our place in them, and that the things that we do have an impact on these systems. So we as individuals are part of families, those families are part of communities, those communities are part of nations. Often the European worldview ends there, again, just concentrated on people and mankind and humankind. But we know now, of course, that we are part of ecosystems, part of the natural environment. Things are extending into that for environmental stewardship and sustainability. As Indigenous people, we extend that one connection more, which is into the spirit world, that we walk with our ancestors and that we have a responsibility for the next 7 generations as well in our decisions, which is a very different way of thinking than planning for the next budget quarter and productivity instead. So when we talk about land acknowledgements, we also need to take a moment to really think about our connection with the land and the land that we're currently standing on. To introduce yourself spiritually, to build a relationship with Mother Earth that provides for all of our relations. And so in the land acknowledgement, we also need to think about things like, what does land spirit do for us? How do we show gratitude to the land? When did your ancestors come to Turtle Island? So a lot of people sometimes relate back to in the land acknowledgement where their ancestors came from. 3rd generation, 4th generation, maybe you're Indigenous descent and you've been here since time immemorial as well. So thinking about your ancestors' relationship with land, what was their first interactions with First Peoples, and whose hearts and footsteps does the land hold? So giving honor to the generations before us who have stewarded the land and thinking about the next generations. So I want to give a couple examples of land acknowledgements, and then I'll give my own land acknowledgement as well. So this one was a collectively made one at a K-12 school in Manitoba, and it reads, out of respect for Indigenous people of Manitoba, we, the students, staff, and families of WMEMS, recognize that our school is related in Treaty 1 territory on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Inuit, and Dakota people, and on the homeland of the Metis Nations. We are learning about the treaties, and we are made on this territory, and about the wrongs that were done to Indigenous people in the past and that continue today. We are committed to be a community of reconciliation and peace. So the things that really resonate about this one with me is that it recognizes not just First Nations, but also Métis. Often the contribution of Métis and Inuit in traditional trade and movement around Turtle Island isn't always included, but I think it is very important to include the Métis and the Inuit. So they have done their homework on the First Nations. They know the nations that lived on those lands. They talk about the oppression and the impacts of colonization. And they also talk about a commitment within their land acknowledgement as well. This one, I have permission from this person to share this one as well. So this person wrote this one to include in their thesis that was submitted. And so it reads, my research centers on curiosity, and I suspect curiosity is universally shared across the human species. However, research in effect science suggests that every emotional facet of human psychology is to a large extent actively constructed by the mind, neurally, psychologically, and very importantly, socially. Curiosity is no exception. Your experiences of curiosity are shaped by your past, your relationships, and your future. My experience of curiosity are shaped by my culture. I am presenting this work from where I grew up, Edmonton, on Treaty 6 territory in Métis Region 4. I live and perform my research in a context that was designed through violence and the systematic erasure of Indigenous ways of knowing. My research has been shaped by this violence, as the stories of curiosity that are most salient and easily accessed continue to be those that privilege Western ways of knowing. As I worked to develop a precise understanding of curiosity, I am challenged to uncover how the culture I live and work in has hidden away non-Western viewpoints on curiosity, skewing the systems that I design. In machine learning, we must continually confront the biases introduced by history. It rings clear to me that I have worked to encompass a diverse set of ideas. I have not escaped the culture I live in, and it also rings clear to me that the systems I am designing are likely raced, gendered, classed, and otherwise biased. As I present my results today, I invite you to reflect on my position, on how my position has influenced this research and how your own endeavors are shaped by the histories of the land on which you pursue. And so this one resonates with me because this person spent a lot of time in thought around their positionality, about the effects of colonization on them as well, on the Indigenous people. They recognize the traditional lands. And then again, they make a call to action in it as well, and a call to action around their own reflection, but also the people listening and reading to this piece of work to have some action too. I will also post the link to this one, just watching the time again in the chat, but this one is a video version of a land acknowledgement. So I wanted to share this one because it gives you an idea that land acknowledgements don't only have to be oral, they can also be video. This one includes the testimony of the elders and representing the different nations, including the Metis in Treaty 7 territory. This one was produced by the Calgary Foundation. And I'll share this one in the chat when we're done here as well. Oh, sorry. Let me jump back again. And my controls, they jump all over the place. All right, so I'll share those two videos in the chat when we're done here, but I wanted to play this audio one as well. So I had a chance to lead a project for our University of Alberta Satellite Club. They had wanted an acknowledgement to play from space that acknowledged the lands that they come on. So I did a quick consultation across Canada, as well as with some cousins, brothers, Indigenous brothers and sisters over in New Zealand too, to create this land acknowledgement that's being played currently from the satellite in space.
Hello, everyone. I'm Bill Flanagan, President and Vice Chancellor.
Just let me start that again.
The University of Alberta. This acknowledgement is a collaboration of ideas, teaching, lived experience, and wisdom led by Jessica Vandenberghe, Dene Ta First Nations, with First Nations and Metis from Turtle Island and our Indigenous cousins from New Zealand. I'm appreciative of the teachings that have been gifted the University of Alberta for this unique land acknowledgement. It is always an honor to be asked to acknowledge where we are from, who we are, and our interconnectedness. Humans are made up of stardust. Humans are the land. Humans are the water. Everything humans are is a gift from our ancestors and relations before us, and we hold it in trust for the generations that will come after us. Humans owe all that we have and all that we are to Mother Earth and the universe. We honor her with gratitude, humility, and respect by caring for her and holding her in the utmost regard. An issue that is in the minds and hearts of people around the world is the issue of humankind's relationship with the universe. Indigenous knowledge systems position human activities that restore balance, promote environmental stewardship, and remind us of our kinship with all things living. I acknowledge that in spite of the oppressive actions of many countries around the world, including Canada, against Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Inuit, Metis, and all Indigenous peoples have been guardians of Mother Earth since time immemorial, and remind all humans to follow natural law, to see the fundamental truths. By accepting these fundamental truths, we see how to graciously take our place in the sacred circle and how to strive to walk in balance in a good way. From my heart and spirit to yours.
And so that one, again, plays from the satellite in space. So I just wanted to showcase a wide variety that land acknowledgements don't need to always be orally given. They should be authentic and meaningful. They should reflect your positionality in it as well. And that helps with the authenticity. So this is mine that I vary, of course, every time that I use, depending where I'm at, but I'll read it out for you. This was made when I was in the Calgary area. So it is out of great respect for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit that I make this land acknowledgement. I want to humbly recognize that the land we gather on today is situated on the traditional territory Treaty 7, the Blackfoot Confederacy in the Métis Battle River Territory, Otipesapmekwe, Métis District. This is a traditional meeting place, and the hearts and footsteps of many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit since time immemorial have contributed to the stewardship of land spirit. I want to express my deep sorrow and anger for the ongoing oppression of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit that they have experienced since colonization. I'm committed to taking up the calls to action every day to work towards reciprocity, healing, and rebuilding trust. I want to express gratitude towards Land Spirit herself for nourishing, healing, protecting, and embracing us. Indigenous people have often acted as stewards for this vital interconnected relationship. I find solace in Mother Nature, and I know she is my relation, and I commit to environmental sustainability in my personal and professional life. We're all relations and respect each other and our beliefs and individual relationships with Land Spirit. So from my heart and spirit to yours. So the elements that really resonate with me that I have included is where I'm coming from. I come out of a spirit of great respect. I want to acknowledge all the demographics of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, the traditional territory, the treaties that of the land, the Métis as well, and their contribution to where we are at. And that recognizing that Inuit as well have been here since time immemorial, and that there are Indigenous ways of knowing, of stewardship towards the land. I recognize the ongoing oppression, so the things that have happened, the truth element of it, and I am committed, and I state that commitment to bring it to top of mind every day. So I remember that every day I got to do something little towards truth and reconciliation. I think about Land Spirit herself and what she does for us. We would not be alive without Land Spirit. And so it's a reminder of my responsibility for environmental stewardship, for sustainability, and just a reminder of how much we depend on the land. And often in urban centers and in the business world and things like that, we forget about that, but we got to bring that to the front of mind. And to remember that we're all relations, and we always talk from heart to heart, spirit to spirit, because we are always talking to each other. And if we talk from those levels, it dissolves those barriers that sometimes we create between each other when it comes to men talking to women or talking to folks of the QIA plus community, or talking with people of different ethnicities or newcomers, but if we talk from a place of hearts and spirits, we're all equal. So that's what I wanted to chat about with today. I know that's a lot of information, and typically something like this would be workshop style, and we have a bit more time. As we move to the questions here, I'll pop the links to those two videos that I skipped over into the chat as well, in case you want to watch those. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jessica. That, again, just like last year, it was very impactful presentation. Gonna have to sit with that and really just learn how to walk with that. And I like how you were stressing it's really learning how to walk with each other in a respectful way and acknowledge that we're walking on the land. For instance, I think it's one of the importance, and this personally is one thing that I'm kind of just trying to learn how to learn to be respectful and walk with each other and have it from a place of sincerity so that it's a sharing. Like, I was raised English, but I'm actually half Acadian. So I see a whole half of my ancestral roots are very thankful that your ancestors helped us as we were dying on your shore, for instance. That's a very emotional thing, I think, for many people in Canada. So for instance, one of the ways that we can all work together to keep a culture alive is you learn the language, you learn different cultural practices, you share, for instance, how many people have the kitchen as the center of the home. Maybe you share recipes. My mom had a wonderful family of friends. She was Cree. And she's now one of the elders. And she loved when she would come visit because she would show us how to make bannock and show us how to do all these different things. Like, it's a wonderful sharing. So I think it's good for us to do our own little search on the net or something to see if we can, maybe if you have language geeks like me, maybe I might want to learn how to speak to like Mi'kmaq people around me, kind of thing, or something like that. Or for instance, you mentioned the 7 sacred truths. Are you able to put in the chat, maybe, is there a link that we can kind of go take a look at to kind of research that?
So there are many places that you can find information on the 7 sacred teachings or the 7 grandfather teachings. They're all taught a little different from different elders and knowledge keepers. But there are books out on it. If you're a book person, there are podcasts out there. There's documentaries and YouTube videos on it as well. But it depends on the nation teaching that you want of those. So for example, like the Ojibwe teach the humility teaching through the bear. And in another nation, they would teach it with a different animal spirit to teach that same teaching. So I'd suggest if you don't know where to start, just Google it, 7 sacred teachings, 7 grandfather teachings, books, documentaries, podcasts, all sorts of things in that area. But also go talk to your local elders and knowledge keepers for the teachings in the traditional way as well.
Absolutely. We had a question on Turtle Island, but that of course was answered with your slide on that. I have to remark, actually I have to ask, when was the Turtle Island concept conceived?
From the beginning. They have always been part of the creation stories from the beginning. Every nation has creation stories that date back to the beginning. I just was gifted another one from an Ontario nation in the Anishinaabe territory, in which the Great Lakes make up the heart of the turtle. And so their creation stories talk about Sky Woman coming down, but it varies across the country, how the stories are told, but they all are on the back of the turtle. Mm-hmm.
The reason why I point that out is because I'm always amazed at like old maps, how mostly accurate they are. And it's not like people were looking from space. So it's quite fascinating that it is very representational. Here's an excellent question in the Q&A. And I think it's a really important perspective because she says she's an immigrant. So thanks for this is from Miriam Jafari. Thanks for the presentation. As an immigrant, I respect this land which has been affected by the soul of First Nations. I'm looking for some special connection with Mother Nature, which I may never have experienced before. For this, I'd like to ask to please let us know if there is some book or resource, I think is what she's getting at, which can shed some more light. Also, if there is any First Nations communities around GTA Toronto.
Yeah, for sure.
Ontario.
Yeah, lots of nations around the Ontario area. Again, Google will help you out. There's all sorts of things in that on the internet these days that help you find. I popped the one in the general chat around native land, in which you can see the traditional nations that are there as well, and all sorts of books in this space as well. So to think of one off the top of my head, I would have a hard time doing. There's just so many that swirl around in my head that we've read and recommend. But let me think about that, and I can send you folks some book recommendations after this.
That's awesome. We're at time, so this last one is kind of a packed question. So I think we would want to let you go away and kind of think about it and give a couple of really good internet resources to help answer Sarah's question on us kind of writing our own land acknowledgements specific to us. So with that, we are at time. Thank you very much for being with us today. Again, I really encourage folks to go to the YouTube archives, watch Jessica's presentation from last year, and some of the other excellent content from celebrating women in engineering from last year. We have a number of wonderful upcoming webinars. Really encourage you to attend with us there. And Marie-Ange, any parting?
Yes, just come to the next webinars. We are very grateful to have Jessica. This webinar was a very learning experience, and I just want to echo what everybody said. It was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Hear, hear.
Thank you so much for joining in, and I'll send off some resources that can be passed to you folks as well. So thank you.
Excellent. Really look forward to it. Thanks, Jessica.